Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, if you've listened to the previous episode, then you'll know exactly what to expect this time round. And if you haven't, I recommend you do that first, because this is part 2 of my discussion with improv expert Heather Urquhart. What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights into the inner workings of improv. How, when you're asking your brain to come up with creative ideas in the spur of the moment, do you ensure you don't say something inappropriate? And how do you write a code of conduct if you're in the business of improv? We pick up the discussion where we left off, so no further introduction needed. Here's part 2 of my discussion with improv expert Heather Urquhart.
Have you seen, I think I might see about this when I met you, but there's like Michael Bay is a Transformers director, and he's speaking at a film conference, and he's reading from an auto cue, and the auto cue breaks, and you suddenly see this person who's like completely in control and command of the room, like just disappear and completely lose the ability to function. It's really interesting. But again, he's gone from like a complete plan, having all the words in front of him, knowing what to say, and then when that is taken away, there's no capability to just be there and talk about the thing, and I think, gosh, that's so interesting. Someone who's obviously at the top of their career, knows so much about their industry. I'm sure that he could talk very engagingly about what he does for a long amount of time, hasn't been given the tools to do that. And so it's fear, isn't it? A lot of the time, it's a natural fear response to, what if I look silly? What if I say the wrong thing? It could be the end of my career / personal life / life, because that's what it comes down to, right? It's that mammalian response. I totally get it. But I think it's trying to teach people to be more resilient to that stuff. And I think because everyone is so scared themselves, when you're a speaker who really connects, or a facilitator, or anyone who connects and acknowledges mistakes, or, the microphone's not working, or you can hear a police siren in the background, I think people warm to you because they can see that vulnerability and they recognize it in themselves. I mean, I always feel like improv audiences are so easy because they're so on our side, because they know that we're making it up. Often they're sitting there going, I'm so glad that that's not me.
Right.
That makes them just enjoy what we do, because they're like, oh, I could never do that. I mean, they could, but it's just a thing that we don't practice a lot, being spontaneous.
I love that. It's interesting, actually, that you were talking about things throwing people off. I think two thoughts occurred to me. We've had this, as listeners will detect, when we put the final show together. Well, we've had some technological issues in the show, right? Where connections weren't working, we've had to restart and whatever else, right? We just get on with it and move on, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation if we let that phase us. But I think tech will go wrong nowadays. We know that. I don't think I've been on a single video call with a group of people where someone somewhere hasn't had some kind of screw up, right? Something hasn't worked, or whether it's them forgetting to go off mute, or the setup that they had, just things just don't work the way we planned. And it's fascinating that you talked about kind of engaging the audience expectations, because I did a presentation last week and it went horribly wrong. And I don't normally do this, and I'd sent I don't like the word slides. I'd sent the images that I used before, and someone had converted them, and they'd converted them badly. And I had checked some of them, but I hadn't. And so literally I'm talking, and I kind of just look out the corner of my eye, and I'm like, that is not what I'm expecting to see. And actually there's a few of these where there's a sort of reveal type element, right? You show one thing and then you show something else. And it was ruining the surprise on multiple occasions. And then there were images that were nothing to do with my presentation coming up. And I remembered, and I just started thinking, oh God. And if this was like about 20% of the way through, it starts to go wrong. And I'm like, well, imagine the rest of it's all gone wrong. And my brain is racing, going, Christ, this is a nightmare. And then I just thought, well, hold on a minute, calm the hell down. Right, you have to own this. And I remembered a story, and it's on a previous episode of this podcast, that Rory Sutherland, one of my guests, had told, where he said, I've never seen anybody lose an audience more quickly than when they shouted at the AV people. And so something had gone wrong with the presentation, and this guy of course it's a man, right, had screamed apparently at the AV people in front of them and lost the audience completely, because that's shouting down, blah, blah. And this story just popped into my head. And I thought, okay, I wouldn't do that naturally anyway, because it's not their fault, right? And more to the point, how does it help anybody? And I thought, I'm going to experiment here. I'm going to do the opposite. And I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the AV people into the heroes of the hour. And so I just kind of went, oh, okay, well, this hasn't worked out the way I had planned. This is not what you're supposed to be looking at. And I can't remember what I did, but there was some sort of deaf thing that got the AV people on side. And behind the scenes, they were scrabbling around. They found the original version of the presentation and then loaded that up, which meant that my clicker didn't work. So they became a feature of the presentation.
That's great.
And so I did this thing, and I just thought, well, so we got to where we went to get to. Kind of just pretended not to be phased, but I was just like inside. I'm like, oh man, this makes it. I can't remember what the next slide is at the best of times, right? Let alone I've just used the word slide. I hate myself. The next image is at the best time. So what can we do? And what was fascinating about it was I kind of thought, oh, I got away with that. And I came, and the biggest compliment people paid was the fact that I hadn't been phased. I can't believe you just kept going with these things.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, isn't that what we should do, right? If you know what you're talking about and you're confident in your own skill, you should just be able to effortlessly glide through this. And we turn it into a feature, not a bug. And and so I just thought, well, what was interesting was that's what people remembered.
Definitely.
That's probably not the message I want them to remember.
Well, isn't it though?
Rather.
Isn't it? Because I think that's the thing. We have a lovely phrase that we use in improv, which is when we do an improv show, we call it the creation of a temporary community. Because everybody that's in that show will only ever see that. Only those people in that auditorium and the people on that stage will ever experience that exact version of that thing together. And that's a massive uniter for people. So I think that talk that you gave will be memorable because it'll be the one that they'll be like, oh, something unusual happened and we saw something alive happen in response to that thing happening. And people can feel the difference between aliveness and presence and just going through the motions and phoning it in, right? And I think now when things go wrong, I'm using quotation air quotes here, but you can't see because it's audio. I don't think of it as going wrong. I think of it as an opportunity, for something else to happen. And genuinely, I'm not just saying that as like a corporate soundbite. I genuinely have retrained my brain to go, oh, something has gone wrong. Something that wasn't going to happen otherwise is now going to happen as a result of this thing that's happened. I love that. Really love it.
And actually, it's interesting because my initial reaction to isn't that what you want to have happen was to say, well, no, because I'm trying to communicate other things. But actually, two things occurred to me as you were talking. One was this idea that they won't remember what you said, they'll remember how you made them feel.
Yeah.
And so it's the emotional memories that will stick for a lot longer. And the second thing is, I'm not teaching these people a syllabus anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So even if you don't remember any, and the likelihood of people being able to remember every single thing that I said, every single is zero.
Well, this is exactly
Absolutely
it.
zero.
This is exactly it. And I think, sometimes people will say, come in and do a talk or do a session. Can you change everybody's entire fundamental belief of life and what they think about this thing and make them remember it in however long? So no, I can't. I really can't do that. I'll do the material and I'll do it to the best of my ability. I'll make it super fresh and I'll make it really engaging. But even if it is the most brilliant session anyone's ever had, chances are they're going to remember one thing, like you say, how they felt, or like what is the principle that they've taken away for them. Because also people hear things through their own filter, don't they? So you might be giving one message, but they'll hear it through their filter, so they'll take something different away from it. So I said that facetiously, but I suspect that they did engage with the material in a different way because they saw you being human, and they will take something maybe more away, not more, but as much, because they'll be thinking about that interaction they had with you as a human on that day.
And what's actually interesting from my perspective is that if I look at the subject, what I'm basically saying, if I had to summarize the message of my stuff, it's like we need to recognize that humans are human. So if you're designing systems to mitigate risk or you've got rules that you want people to comply with, we have to start recognizing the realities that are there. And so unexpected things shouldn't phase us. We should be equipped to deal with those. And we should be designing environments that make it more likely we'll get the outcomes we're looking for. So it's not off brand. And in fact, one of the thoughts I did have was to say, well, should I make that happen every single time?
Yeah, interesting.
Which is back to your point. And then my gut reaction was no, because actually, one, you can always find things that have gone wrong.
I was going to say, let me reassure you that so many things are going to go wrong for you from here on.
Yeah,
so many.
Well, it's because it's almost like it's almost like bring it on, right? I want
no,
that to happen.
I am joking, but I think like to not have the fear of it, it's so powerful. It's like, again, we say to people, I'm not saying don't have a plan, just saying don't have the fear of it, of it not going as you planned. That's a really powerful thing to know. Like, I can just stand up there and be resilient, whatever happens. The message might change. Or do you know the phrase, hold on tightly and let go lightly?
No.
I love that. It's like one of my favorite phrases for improv and for life. But it's exactly that. Like, come in with an intention, with a belief, a feeling, a message. But if if you need to yield or change, to be able to do that with grace and lightness, and I think that's a lot of what you're talking about. I hope this is what the thing is that is in common maybe between what you talk about and what I talk about, is that lack of rigidity. And yes, you do want people to have rules, but inevitably they will stretch and adapt and change according to when they meet the humans that interact with them, right? Things change all the time.
And I was thinking that I love that. Absolutely, wow, I love that, because I was thinking it's also, if we think about, let's take something that neither of us particularly enjoy, I suspect, meetings,
Mm.
right? The old classic of there's no point in having a break, mind if you don't change it. I love that idea of come in and be very confident. And so if you're going to a meeting where you're talking about something, then know what you're talking about, know your view, have a strong position, be confident in what you're talking about. In other words, you're not just turning up and winging it, particularly if it's something that matters, you've got a view on it, but then be prepared to listen to other people. And so I love that. What I think you've pointed to there brilliantly is resilience in the general world, right? Things aren't going to go according to plan. You just got to recognize that thing. But also, I love this idea of interactions with other people, because I think that's great, because it says, I am confident of where I stand. And if I'm not confident, well, I should go find out, right? Before I'm confident of these things, have the backup as part of it, but recognize that we don't have to be fundamentalists.
Yeah, definitely.
And actually, the purpose of sitting down and talking to other people is to hear what they have to say. Now, that might be confirming what we already know, or they might prove to us that our arguments are better than we thought they were, or whatever. But equally, we should have the possibility of having those views overturned, changing our minds on things. So I love that. I think that's a really powerful phrase for
Yeah,
life in general.
totally.
But I love that idea, because it's not what if you'd said to me up front, this is what Heather is going to say, I would have gone, huh, that doesn't feel like an improv-y thing, but I think it is. I think it's exactly the spirit of what you do.
So too. I mean, again, like we're going meta here, but I think, oh, what did I think we were going to talk about today? What did I plan to talk about? You know,
It's all
but I mean, I had some thoughts of what we might, and I thought we might talk about music more actually, because that's the context in which we met. But I'm so much more interested in what comes out of the moment and where the conversation flows. And I tell you what's interesting, because I know Neil and I know you interviewed him a while ago, and I started to listen to the episode you did with him, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to stop, because I want to listen to that after this without the preconceptions of,
right.
because I don't, you know what I mean? I want this conversation about improvisation to be improvised without any
Yes.
former expectations of what it should be. And I think, having to sort of, that I've got a bunch of things that we could talk about, but I'd much rather genuinely see where the conversation takes us, because that's, again, modeling what I do, I hope.
I was going to pick up music, and we perhaps we should, but as you're talking, I mean, there's something that really I think obviously comes out where if I looked at the overlap between our worlds, and if I think about the word rules,
Mm.
and what I find fascinating is if I talked about rules in the sense that a lot of the clients I work with, and the kinds of rules I'm talking about, almost the Ten Commandment type stuff, and then I compare it to the rules of the game that you play when you sort of think about improv, is back to the point about there are rules there, right? Yes, you're making it up as you're going along, but you have rules where you'll interact with your fellow performers. You both know what the rules of the game are,
Yeah.
right? And so the chaos and the randomness and the sort of inspiration stuff, yes, that's of course that's there. But you mentioned that underpinning it are a set of rules and processes. And I wondered how you think about those two things getting together. Are rules, they're helpful, I'm guessing, because that's what allows the construct to flourish. Because if it genuinely were, you didn't have any kind of methodology to what you were doing, then it wouldn't be as effective, is my sense. And so, how tightly defined are they? And is that, and presumably you view that as that's helpful, not unhelpful or hindering?
Yeah. I mean, God, this is fascinating to me because, yeah. So the company I work for, we called it "and also" because we couldn't decide what to call it. Because we're like, oh, well, it's sort of about freedom, but it's sort of about discipline, and it's sort of about, yeah. Well, it was like balance between chaos and order almost. There's lots of polarities. So in the end, we decided to call it "and also" because we want it to be about, well, it's about this and about this. So again, that thing between chaos and order is really interesting in terms of rules and creativity. And I think, because obviously I teach it as well as performing a lot. And so I think about the unconscious incompetence through to conscious competence, that kind of sector thing. That, are you familiar with that?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sure everybody that listens to this is. But I think when you're starting improvisation, just the thought of allowing yourself to say the first thing that comes into your head is scary. And so I'm getting people not to learn how to be creative, but how to unlearn to criticize their own ideas. As I think of something, it's not they haven't thought of what the invitation is. Often they've thought of 6 things and rejected them before they say the thing that they say. So I think to begin with, it's about being incredibly gentle about whatever you say is great. Then you get into some of the more technical aspects of it. So, I mean, an absolute classic thing in improvisation, I'll say to you very early on in learning it, is don't ask questions. So, really simplistic example of this might be if you or I were in an improvised scene together, and I said, Christian, what's that? And pointing to an empty space and putting all of that work, all of that cognitive load, all of that imaginative work onto you. Whereas the idea with improv is we build on each other's ideas. So I might say, oh, look, it's a tiny little cat. And then you'd go, oh, yes, it's a tabby. She'd add something onto it. But if I'm asking you questions like, who are you? Where are we? What are we doing? What is your name? I'm not contributing anything. I'm sort of,
Oh, that's really, because that's really unhelpful, right? Because then suddenly I'm like, Chris, where are we? Right. And I've got to, okay.
yeah.
So
And
yeah, I love
I'm
that.
putting the work onto what we call our scene partner. Now, unfortunately, when someone's starting out, their fear response means that basically all they ever do is ask questions in scenes. So they'll be like, so yes, how do we know each other? Because it's not the character talking, it's the human improviser, right? Because they're searching for ideas. So naturally,
Yeah.
they're going to ask a lot of questions. So the reason I say this is because 101 will be okay. So in very early classes, we'll say, try to not ask questions because it's just a really quick way of getting past that fear response and putting information in rather than looking for information. However, once you get a certain point into improv, if you said don't ask questions, that would be crazy because you can ask really interesting questions like, don't you love me anymore? That would be a great question to ask somebody in a scene, wouldn't it? 'Cause you get so much emotional content from that. The audience would be sitting on the edge of their seat going, do they? So at a certain point, you have to let go of that rule. But it's just that would be a firm rule for the beginning that a teacher might say, don't ask questions because we know then we can eliminate that problem. What we want to get onto later is just the principles of improv, which is, really listening to the idea and not just the words on the top, but what is this person offering me as an idea? You know, now I can't think of an example of that, but sometimes if someone comes on it with a certain disposition, they might be offering you, like a creepy ghost story, for example. They're not saying the words; they're just kind of giving you the idea through the way they're behaving. And you only get that by kind of really listening to what they're saying. But if someone comes to an improv class and they say, what's the secret to improv? And you say, well, it's listening. Doesn't sound very sexy. So you need to do some more sort of concrete
God, that's
roles.
dull.
Yeah, right. You need to have some real concrete rules to begin with, but then later on, you just need to let go of all of them and trust that what you're doing is like listening and agreeing and building on ideas on a deeper level. Because there's other things like saying yes. Obviously, yes, and is a thing that people talk about a lot, but it's not saying literally say yes to every single thing that someone says. An example we give in teaching is if a character pulls a gun on you and says, I'm going to shoot you, you wouldn't say yes. You'd say, no, please, please. I've got children. The character would say no, but the offer to someone pulling a gun on you is you're saying yes to that offer by reacting in a fearful way. I'm getting meta now, but hopefully this is making sense. So,
No, it's making perfect sense. Making perfect
so
sense.
yeah, so there's some
Uh,
kind of more basic rules, but then like letting go of them later on. And I'm sure there's lots of I'm trying to think, I'm sure there are lots of other professions like that where, you almost have like safety rules earlier on, but then you kind of transcend them a little because you're in more flow state, I suppose. Yeah, it's about flow state, isn't it? So I'm thinking maybe athletes or other circus performers or something like that. You have to train really hard in the sort of technical element, but then once you get good at it, then you find it, actually let go of that a little bit and just sort of perform what you're doing.
if I think about lots of skills that we develop, you need that discipline to start with, and you almost need the framework around which you can start to explore. And if I compare that to what we do with kids, right, you let them crawl around and play, but obviously there's constraints to that. We don't want them wandering around the kitchen and opening cupboards and crawling on things because that's dangerous. Or So we want this freedom. So we need that. We need those constructs. As you get older, you can take those guardrails away. And so as you get more experience with something, you don't need those. But those that you've almost drilled into yourself what those core principles are. And so I really like this idea of there are going to be stages where the rules matter more because it's a skill that's evolving
Yeah.
and you're practicing, and you need those guidelines to do that because you don't have the experience of it to be able to make those determinations. And they're useful disciplines to learn that then become, I guess, second nature, or you can discard them because they were only relevant at that stage of your learning or
Yeah,
experience.
totally. And I think, yeah, it's interesting what you say about children because I've got a 3 and a 1-year-old at the moment, and people, so children are great improvisers, aren't they? But no, they're rubbish. But that's not true. They are in some ways, and they are not in others because the memory and the recall and the stuff like that. They are great at play though, and that's so interesting for me and my partner, who are both improvisers, to work out. We call it game of the scene. It's a bit like a thing in clowning. It's like recognize patterns and repeating them. So even though they come up spontaneously, you're noticing and repeating what's happening. So with the kids, really like discovering those patterns with them as they do them. It's really, really fun. But I'd noticed it's quite interesting with grandparents or other friends or relatives that they'll see the kids play in a certain way, especially if there's a game. They're going to know you don't do it like that. It's so interesting that even when they're 3 and 1, people still need to correct them to tell them how to play correct. And it's so hard to, again, let go of the preconceptions of what you think play is. And I thought one of the things I really spoke to me in your book is that idea of like, why do you do things? Well, that's how we've always done things. And I think that even when it comes to playfulness and experimentation, you can get quite stuck in your ways, even though on the surface of it, what you're doing is very playful. You still have to keep bringing yourself to the moment to make sure that you actually are being spontaneous, because you can fake being spontaneous as well. That sort of thing. It's all about things.
Oh, go on. That's interesting.
Well, I think it's all about like keeping yourself safe. So I think sometimes when people have been doing improv for a long time, when they start, they're genuinely surprised by everything that comes out of their mouth. And then as they get a bit,
I off.
yeah, right. Yeah, right. But then they get a bit better at it. And then they kind of go, oh, I should be good at this now. And so it sort of actually shuts them down a little bit because they get less spontaneous in their spontaneity. I mean, it's hard to explain, but people then start to sort of weirdly plan their, even if it's just 10 seconds ahead, they're less in the moment because they're trying to get it to be good because they think they should be good at this by now. But I think it's interesting. It's like something like meditation or yoga or even going for a run. It's like you do it once. Unfortunately, you have not solved the mystery of running or yoga. You have to go and do it again. And it might be easier or harder the next time. You might be better at it because you've done it before, but you still have to, bring yourself to it afresh each time. You haven't like solved it. So I think that's so much the case with improv, that after a certain amount of time, you can actually get weirdly less spontaneous. You go through a little phase. You have to sort of break through the ceiling. I'm sure that's the same with many learning things though, right? You kind of think,
I think that's really interesting because it's sort of you're almost it's a little bit more. I mean, you can see in certain contexts where it's confidence. It's not exactly the same thing, but I think there's a presumption that we all have, which is that there's a sort of, if you were to draw the charts, right, the more time you spend doing something, the better you will get at it, right? That's the simple narrative that we're taught, and it doesn't work like that. And so we can often find there are moments where we go backwards in order to go
yeah,
forwards. There are moments where we are, we get ahead of ourselves. We think we ought to be, and you can see, whether it's skiing or any other sorts of things where we're sort of, it doesn't sit nicely on that chart that says every additional minute I spend will result in me being a lot better. And so I think, it's not exactly the same point, but I think there are hiccups that happen. And so this model of expertise that we have, I think is, if you look back at it and say, well, I've done this, I ought to be good at it. Well, in one context, that might give you overconfident. Well, I am good at it because I've done loads of these things, right? So dangerous. And I could see in a situation where you sort of think, well, improv, it's kind of like it's a skill I have now developed. I've done my 10,000 hours. So everything that comes out ought to be amazing. And therefore, because actually you're ruining the underlying thing. The underlying thing is spontaneity. And if you overthink, I can see if you overthink it, problematic. So I suspect it's probably broader than just this idea of overthinking things. It may well just be that we have this equation in our heads that's a very linear equation: more time equals more expertise. And we can see that, like if you do something badly for long periods of time, picked up a bad habit, right, that doesn't make us better at the thing at all. And I think that this one of the things I pick at, the point of the thing in the book is really to look at it and say, actually, just because somebody's been doing something for a long period of time doesn't actually mean that they're better at
Exactly.
it. They might not have a clue what they're doing. They might be doing it really badly, or circumstances might have changed.
Exactly.
That means the experience they had was valid for what they did, but it's now useless because, hey, we've invented the internet or something.
And I think that brings me, back to the point I was saying at the beginning, which is it's the people higher up in organizations that are less sometimes able to improvise and adapt, or they're more fearful of these mistakes because there's this mistaken belief like, well, I should have all the answers to this by now. And of course, mistakes happen all the time. And normally they're a huge opportunity for learning, but people will try to get a little bit more safe, I think, the further they go in anything. And rather than embracing like those opportunities to fall off the horse or, run into the wall or whatever the equivalent is, so that you can learn. Or
And I think that corporate one's really interesting because I have a view that one of the reasons that happens is that if I have spent my whole career doing a certain thing and it's got me to that position of seniority, if I acknowledge that the world has changed, right? In other words, my experience is valueless. If I'm somebody of limited confidence, I might sit there and say, actually, well, if that's true, then I shouldn't be in this
yeah,
position. And so I think if we look in a sort of patriarchal, prejudiced society, I actually think one of the challenges that we've got is that we like the narrative of meritocracy. And I speak as somebody, I went to a decent university, but I also used to hide behind the fact, well, because I have demonstrated that I'm an intelligent person. Right? In other words, I have talent.
mhm,
And actually, what I realized was, yeah, of course, I'm not an idiot, right? But a lot of it came with privilege that I was born with, and so actually, that's uncomfortable.
yeah,
But I'm cool with that. I can cope with that, and I'm open to challenging that and being a bit self-deprecating and laughing about it, and recognizing the truth of what's there, which is I got lucky. Yeah, and that's not to say I'm not talented, but I think for some people that's really difficult because if you started to open the door to that, slightly crass comparison, but it's analogous to the slave trade thing. Well, we better not talk about the reality of what happened. It's awkward for us because that leads to reparations and questions of why do I have all the things I have and blah, blah, and that's awkward and difficult. And so I think these senior people in organizations, it's much better to close that door and not even give a chink of the fact that you might not know everything. Because if you don't, well, why are you in that position?
I think like one of the most common things people say is, what if I can't think of something to say? What if I don't know the answer? And I think, and in an applied practical sense, if someone's speaking, they open the floor to questions. I think one of the most powerful things a person can say is, I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question. Here's what I do know. Here's what I know around that. People are so frightened of saying that I don't know. In improv classes, this is like my favorite technique ever, which I got from John Kramer, who I used to work with in the May days, is if people went blank and they couldn't think of anything to say, we call it the nirvana moment. And we'd say, what was that? And it's like, well, if you think Buddhist monks will spend 40 plus years meditating, trying to empty their mind of all thought, but in an improv class, you can achieve that in like 10 minutes. So we would always laugh and say, going completely blank is a moment to be completely celebrated because actually, if you're trying to do that, it's impossible. But again, not fearing it, right? Not fearing that moment of like, I don't know what to say. What am I going to do? There's nothing there because there will be nothing, but then there'll always be something after it.
That's so true. I absolutely love that because you're right. Compared to the daily hectic where we've got tons of crap going on in our minds, right? If we're sitting there just genuinely, I can't think of anything. That's awesome,
I
right? Because it
know.
means we've taken not 100, we won't have taken 100% of your brain capacity, but it's taken the bits that you're aware
Yeah.
of and kind of gone. And so you won't be thinking about the fact that you might need to go to the toilet or the shopping or
Yeah.
whatever, right? All the other woes are forgotten. So I love that idea of kind of, I mean, it's a very powerful. It's like a great way of distracting yourself from the day to day. Is put yourself in that position, right? Because as you say, you are clearing it. I love that.
Yeah, it's fine. It's really, I love that idea, especially when people get really sheepish about, I can't think of anything. And I always say, congratulations, you can't think of anything. You've reached nirvana.
One question I had for you is one of the hang up I have about opening my mouth, for want of a better phrase, is that worrying about what comes out is being inappropriate.
Um,
And I don't mean, for example, swearing. I mean literally the brain does something crazy, and I'll say, I might be, you say something that's
Yeah.
offensive,
Yeah.
right? That sort of some mischievous part of your mind thinks it would be funny to raise something, and so you give it free rein, and out pops something that is possibly the worst thing you could say.
Yeah.
And so, how do you manage that? Because I mean, it may just be me that I have a greater propensity to do it, and I recognise it's the product of a mischievous mind in some cases. But there are, we all know, for example, that we talk amongst friends. You might say things which you would absolutely not dream of saying in
My
public.
goodness. Yeah. I mean,
Um,
that's a bonding thing.
and so how do you stop that from happening? Because that's been the biggest fear for me, is that I will do that one
I
day.
mean, this,
And therefore I think I censor myself too much just to stop that remote chance, because I see the risks of that being so great.
yeah, I think the short answer is you can't stop it because, I think that's a really common fear. It's a fear I share myself. What if I'm on stage one day and in one of the big shows in front of 1,000 people, I just accidentally say something like massively racist or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's really scary. Um,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think there's an interesting thing here, which is when people start doing improv, inevitably, there is, as you say, the chattering mind, which is on a beginner's course, for example, a lot of the taboo material comes out. And even if people aren't intending to be offensive, they might like go places that they weren't always intending, sex, death, violence, drugs, all those kind of more taboo areas.
Yes.
So I think one approach is you've got to kind of get through that stuff. And there's a sort of permission field in an improv course where if everyone's in the same position, that if something like that pops out, no one's going to judge you. I think the secondary thing to that is, we have a code of conduct, we have all the things that you expect to. I mean, and talking of rules, it's quite interesting coming up with a code of conduct for an improv school. But you can't say,
Oh,
don't say
yeah.
something offensive. You can't say that because people are going to accidentally. So we have to kind of legislate for best intention and behaving in a consistently offensive manner as opposed to an innocent comment. Like if someone's consistently, for example, I don't know, an older man getting into scenes with younger women and they're always turn into a sexual relationship, that's going to be a problem, right? And that has happened because people are using it as a way to.
I mean, I feel guilty laughing now, right?
No, but laugh with
yeah,
it.
it's the
But yeah,
point,
it's
right?
interesting. So it's like, how do you legislate for that? And that's been a really interesting challenge for us over the years. But what I was going to say is, it's not the student's problem. We're asking them to be spontaneous and kind of get all that stuff out. And it's sort of up to us as the teachers and facilitators to find a way to respectfully and gently like stop anything that looks like it's going into a direction that would upset or harm anyone without shutting down someone's spontaneous side. And that is very much, call it according to everyone's reaction in the room, because there's a difference between doing a scene at a funeral where everyone's laughing, which on one hand you might go, well, that's quite dark. What if there's somebody in the room that's recently experienced a bereavement? That could be on the edge of it, but it's not inherently offensive. But if somebody in the room was upset, I would stop the scene. As opposed
Yeah.
to, again, as you say, like some comedy sketches, I think about some of the comedy I like, Chris Morris, like it's super dark, it's super offensive, but that's kind of the funniness of it, is that it's satirical and everything like that. So again, talking of rules, transcending rules in earlier stages, I'll always sort of say, let's try and play it like PG, like as if your grandma was watching the class. If we don't do that, that's fine. Things are going to slip out, but I might stop things earlier than I would otherwise. And then again, as people have kind of moved through all that taboo material, which they inevitably do, like just all that stuff comes out. And then it's more of a choice, right? You've got more of a sensibility of, you weirdly do get a little bit quicker at being very spontaneous. So you can edit out those things without editing yourself. Also, you can choose, am I going to say this thing or I'm going to say something adjacent to it? So you can get a little bit more control about what you're creating. But personally, I think you have to go through all that to be stuff, and we shouldn't fear it. And certainly, in this day and age, it's scary. It's super scary, but we try to like hold the space in a way that looks after everybody in the room. So that means the people that have potentially been offended and the person that's potentially offended unintentionally by, not letting things run on too long, or, just saying, hey, someone said one thing when I asked them to say the first thing that came into their head. Let's not judge each other because we're all going to say crazy things. But yeah, it's scary. I totally get it. And I share the fear. I think we probably all have that, right? So again, it's
Yeah.
about getting past that fear And then hopefully by getting past the fear, you're less likely to say something like, because you're not in that panic, right? People say
Right.
and do mad things when they're feeling panic. So it's about like tapping into the relaxation.
Okay, that's a nice way to look at it. Right. Okay. So back to my other example. So the guy shouted. So if you weren't in control of your materials, standing up on stage, and something goes wrong with the presentation, right, it's panic, and therefore you might actually scream at the AV people, not because you're the sort of, I mean, you might be the sort of person that screams at people because that's how you operate, but you might just be screaming because that's your outlet
Totally.
and you're not in control of the situation. Right. So actually, if we feel confident in what we're doing and we've practiced our art enough, and we're approaching it in the right way, that's less likely to happen because we're in control.
Exactly. And also if you've taken loads of improvisation training, so you're really comfortable with making mistakes. That was a joke because, I was being self-promotional. But
Got
um
it. I got it. Do that again. Do that.
but I kind of, that's one route to it. But yeah, anything that's going to make you feel, I guess, more comfortable being yourself, being a bit more loose, I suppose, is really I mean, a friend of mine, Steve Bustin, he's a speaking coach. And actually, he does improv classes, but a lot of the things he will say is like, just have bullet points. Don't be slavish about it. Like, what's going to help you feel more loose and more yourself? Sort of the same kind of thinking, I suppose, improvisational thinking. Like, accept what's happening. Do it.
Heather, you mentioned this idea of writing rules for improv, and I wanted you to explore that because I think it's like a fascinating challenge. Because on the one hand, it's freedom; on the other, to have some limits. How do you start to even think?
So do you mean like our code of conduct for our...
Yes. Yeah.
What's fascinating to me is up until maybe as recent as 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know if any improv school, certainly no improv school in the UK, even had a code of conduct. And because, as you say, it was like, it's just fun arts classes and, why would we need to? And if you do, then you're going to restrict everything. But, having learnt the hard way, we realize that we have to have a set of rules that we adhere to. Because then again, even if we break them, then we've got a guideline to have a conversation, right? So we do have a code of conduct, and it's all the things you'd imagine that I think you'd have in any business, which is, we wouldn't tolerate hate speech or bullying or prejudice. But again, if people are improvising, what if they're playing a character who's unpleasant? What if they say something they wouldn't ordinarily say? So again, we have to kind of legislate for things like that are going to happen sometimes. And we talk about receiving things with their intention. I think, again, in fact, you say, one of the things that struck me was your book is, if something goes wrong with a rule, it's a person problem. If something goes wrong several times, it's a rule problem. Almost with us, it's the opposite, in the sense of someone's going to break one time because they're human. But if something's consistently happening with someone or some exercise, then we might have to look at that person or that material, that exercise or something. This is again an exercise I retired, which was getting people to think creatively. You'd get them to rant angrily about something that you wouldn't normally be annoyed about. So like, talk to me about why you hate chocolate or puppies or something, like really vociferously why you hate it. Really fun exercise. But you could do the opposite and you could say, okay, justify why you absolutely love something less fun. I don't want to give too many examples to be offensive, but like police brutality, for example, right? So again, if it was a rehearsal context and a group of people that knew each other, you might be able to have fun being creative about what you could see as a positive in that, just as a sort of brain stretching exercise. But exercises like that, I've just retired from public classes because they can just be really triggering. You don't know what people's history is, and it's just not worth it. So I think there's a sort of the tax of certain exercises and certain jokes isn't worth it. So we just don't go there. And the other thing that's interesting is that sometimes people say offensive things because they think it will be helpful, because they think it will be surprising and they think it will be funny and they think that will be helpful. So audiences will shout out brothel, taxidermy, stuff like that all the time, because they think that's going to give us good material to improvise. And so quite often these days we'll say, that's great. Can I have something else, please? Because who wants to watch comedy about sex workers? You'd have to have a really good reason to do it. I'm sure there's lots of really biting comedy you could do about that, but we're improvising. We haven't got time to form a sharp angle on it. So it's okay for us to sometimes say, no, I'm not going to do that right now. there's so many things I could improvise about. So again, it's about that balance between what's okay to explore because we're improvising and we don't want to beat ourselves up. And when do we go, you know what? So much material in the world. We don't have to beat ourselves up about saying no to that one and doing something else. So yeah, it's a real fine balancing it. But again, it's almost like it's our rules, I suppose, for the students are almost a blueprint for having conversations because things come up all the time that are difficult. And then you just have to have a conversation because it'll be different the next time. So yeah, that is interesting and tricky and constantly evolving. And even sometimes it'll be like one word in a sentence that evolves because culture has evolved, you know. So I think there was assume people's best intention. We've played around with that idea a lot and how to express that. And that's evolving all the time. What can I say?
Wow. No, and what was really interesting there was I was thinking about, I don't know, Ricky Gervais, people like that, right? Who goes places which are inappropriate and offensive. And, you know, if you're watching one of his shows, you kind of know that that's there. And I always think it's weird when people complain. You go, "Oh, it's outrageous." Well, don't go watch him, right? Nobody's dragging you to see that. And it's not, he hasn't ambushed you with his show. You know what that's about.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about it is he can go places that I could see. I imagine his creative process takes him to some, like, yeah, because that's craft.
Yeah.
And so I think what I loved about your answer there was this idea of, okay, I could go there and I could probably make something work with that, but I'm just not even going to try because that is a dangerous territory. And so let's just steer away from that. And so you're not saying it's not game. It's just within the confines of where you're at. You don't have enough time to think that through. And so it's perfectly okay. Stand-up comedians may choose to go to topics that you wouldn't do in an improv thing, not because they're not funny or you couldn't get something out of it, but there is a risk of you getting that wrong in the moment. And so it's a safer thing not to touch.
And again, I think there's slightly different circumstances. I mean, one of the shows I do is a Tim Burton inspired improv show. So it's like dark fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales type stuff. And actually these days we do put a trigger warning on it because, for example, there's a lot of child murder in that because that's what Grimm's fairy tales, Roald Dahl, those kind of stories do.
Right.
And yes, it's done in a very fairy tale, fantastical way. But now we've just gone, let's just warn people that there might be some, you know, even though it's theatrical, it's still violence and there's still very dark ideas. And again, you just don't know what people are coming into the room with. So although you're improvising, you can have a set of expectations. And again, it's know your audience, isn't it? And also some improvisation groups. I mean, there's some groups in Europe who do very political improvisation and they actually use the audience and the strong feelings in the room about certain things to improvise about stuff that's really uncomfortable. But again, they let the audience know that's what they're doing before and they have transparency about it. I think it's all about expectations and it's all about expectations on both sides, I think.
Love it. Wow. Heather, as I knew would be the case, the conversation could just keep going.
I know.
But time is against us, and I'm sure we'll have further conversations, and I massively look forward to that. I'd love to have you back on the show to explore some of the other things. I'd love to do some work with you on something, so we'll explore that separately.
Come and do some improv.
But yeah, totally. But before we do that, I do want to turn to this is not improv that I'd like you to do now, is to do the standard thing of, if people are interested, as I'm sure they will be, how can they find you and learn more about what you do and hire you?
I mean, I think, and also improv.com. Hang on a minute, I just forgot my own website. Wait, I am called improv.com. Blah, blah. Can't even
Don't
speak.
make up things. This is no time to improvise. What's the website?
It's and also improv.com, I think. Oh my God, that's so funny.
Amazing. I'll tell you what we'll do. We will put that. I will put the correct
it is
answer
that.
in the show
I
notes.
doubted myself. That's so funny. I doubted myself. That's what happens when you think about things too much. And I've also had too many websites over the years, and also improv.com. And it's because it's a new business, right? So it's super scary because we have a performance company, the Maydays. Please come and see us. But actually recently we decided to split about a year ago our training from our performance. So, and also improv is very much focused on what we've been talking about today, actually, which is like all the ideas of improvisation and how they can help people in their lives and work and all kinds of juicy things like that. So do get in touch. Heather at and also improv.com, or, just find us in all the LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram things, whatever your social media crack of choice is, you will find us there.
Amazing. Listen, thank you so much. As I say, links to all of those things in the show notes for anyone who didn't have a pen to hand or is confused by the repeating different versions that you gave them. That was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. And I can't wait to have further conversations and do more fun things with you.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Heather for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Heather, the work that she does, and the show that she is part of, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do on whichever platform you're listening to it on. It really does help. And to discover episodes of the show that you might have missed before, visit the website humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, keep improvising, and thank you so much for listening.